In contrast to merchant shipping, the Navy evokes images of grandeur. Great vessels traveling the seas, transporting soldiers and goods to protect the vast waterways and shorelines of the homeland. But with war comes a great deal of absurdity. Rooted in political conflict, war is inevitably marked by confusion and blunders. As a military organization, the Royal Canadian Navy has had its share of problems. Its history has been punctuated with moments of drama, scandal, and controversy. Its very creation was the result of over 50 years of debate in the House of Commons. In the 19th century, Canada, still a British colony, benefited from the services of the largest naval force in the world, Great Britain's. Already towards the end of the 19th century, the British feared the likelihood of war with Russia or Germany. And for some time, their status as rulers of the waves had been threatened. To be up to the challenge, the country had to muster its full military strength. When Canada requested the Empire's support to protect the Gulf of St. Lawrence, Great Britain claimed that it was merely a detail that fell under the responsibility of the Canadian Navy. The Governor-General, the Duke of Argyll, diplomatically suggested to England that Canada would not be opposed to having a training ship if the imperial government would consent to provide the vessel. England offered Canada the Charybdis, an aging steam corvette. For Canada, it turned out to be more of a curse than a blessing.
The Charybdis needed a great deal of work before it could be used for anything. It became a public scandal when some local notables went to visit the ship and fell through the rotten gangplank, and one or two of them was drowned. So the government of Sir John A. Macdonald quietly gave the Charybdis back to the British. So it was not really a valuable gift.
For 30 years, the ghost of the old corvette frequented the House of Commons. But around 1909, with no end in sight to ongoing discussions, disturbing omens began to emerge in Europe. The Kiel and Wilhelmshaven naval shipyards were the site of feverish activity. Germany was seeking nothing less than to rule the world's sea routes. Canadians began to worry. In 1910, the Sir Wilfrid Laurier government officially established the Canadian Navy Services. The act was barely passed before old passions were rekindled. The age-old debate on the very nature of Canada was back in the spotlight once again.
The whole scheme came apart because of this divide between English Canadians who wanted quicker action and nationalists in Quebec who were reluctant to do anything at all. Partly because of that conflict, Laurier loses the election of 1911. In comes the conservative government of Robert Borden. Borden tried to do both. Give a gift of money to the British and carry on with naval development, but on a much smaller scale than Laurier, much less aggressive and ambitious.
While Borden was trying to get the situation under control, the German war machine was in full gear. The Royal Canadian Navy was still in its infancy. In 1911 and 1912, there were 112 voluntary enlistments and 149 desertions.
Borden was so discouraged that he gave up on naval development. He was just beginning to think about it again in the summer of 1914 when the First World War broke out, and it was too late.
The administrative foot-dragging was unbearable. Eventually, Richard McBride, then Premier of British Columbia, couldn't bear the delay any longer. On August 4th, without authorization and using provincial funds, he purchased 2 submarines from a shipyard in Seattle. McBride proved to be a clever negotiator because these submarines were actually intended for Chile. Secretly, under the cover of darkness, they were transported to the military base in Esquimalt. With pride, and no doubt a hint of sarcasm, McBride donated his submarines to the Navy. They were in service from 1914 to 1917. During this time on the Atlantic coast, no such initiative had been taken to defend the nation. In fact, politicians were unable to come to a consensus on the issue of whether or not Canada should build a fleet of warships. The solution that seemed the most acceptable was to offer the British Empire a contribution in men rather than in vessels. Accordingly, the Navy's personnel was increased to 6,000 officers and sailors. But even that was not enough, because the German fleet was merciless. The wheels of war were in motion. By 1914, Britain was engaged in battle. The Germans, convinced they could starve Britain in only a matter of months, began a program of unrestricted submarine warfare. Allied shipping losses mounted, and essential parts of Britain's naval force were blown to pieces. It was total carnage. Britain was hurting badly. To continue, they urgently needed food, fuel, and weapons. Canada's Navy came to the rescue with a system wherein its vessels would escort merchant ships bringing supplies to England.
In order to keep submarines away from merchant vessels, in early 1917, the British, as a desperation, began to sail much of their North Atlantic commerce in convoys, groups of 30, 40, 50 merchant ships sailing together with naval escorts around them.
The convoy system brought many ships to the Halifax harbor. In 1917, near the end of the war, a tragedy occurred there that would forever tarnish the history of the Navy. Around 8 o'clock on the morning of December 6th, a ship loaded with explosives entered the port. The ship, a French munitions vessel named the Mont Blanc, was expected. Activities of this kind were entirely routine in times of war. In the city, life was carrying on as usual. Workers were punching in for work, shops were opening for business, and children were playing in the streets on their way to school. On this rather ordinary Thursday morning, nothing in the harbor suggested that disaster was imminent. The IMO, a Belgian ship, was preparing to leave the port. Everyone seemed to have things under control, but suddenly the unthinkable happened. Against all expectations, the IMO collided with the munitions ship. The steel hulls scraped against each other, throwing off sparks that ignited a fire. Thousands of people, men, women, and children, streamed to the piers to watch the fire devour the ship. But it was a dangerous show. The ship was literally a floating bomb, Within minutes, it was already too late. A quarter of the city was destroyed. Within a matter of seconds, Halifax was in flames. The force of the blast made everything collapse. The explosion was devastating. It was the largest detonation ever set off by man before the era of the nuclear bomb. The death toll on that fateful day was over 1,600, reaching up to 2,500 in the days that followed. Another 9,000 people were injured. The citizens of Halifax were forever marked by the impact of the disaster. The port fell under the Navy's jurisdiction at that time. So, in the eyes of the public, they were to blame for this terrible tragedy. But 20 years later, the Royal Canadian Navy would have a chance to redeem themselves.